The picture frame had shifted. That's what caught my eye first. It hung just above the mantel, a photo of Audrey and me on our honeymoon in Maine, grinning like fools as the sun set over the Atlantic. For 10 years, that frame hadn't moved an inch. But now, it was crooked, tilted just enough to make me notice. It wasn't like Audrey to leave anything out of place. She was meticulous about the house. Our house, a colonial revival in Richmond, Virginia. She said she liked things just so, and for the most part, I let her have it. I didn't care how the pillows were fluffed or the curtains were drawn, as long as it made her happy. I adjusted the frame, straightened it, but as I stepped back to admire my work, something felt off. Not with the frame, but with the house itself. It was quiet, too quiet. Audrey wasn't there. She'd left an hour earlier, dressed in her new maroon blouse and black pencil skirt, claiming she had an afternoon meeting with a potential new client. Interior design, she said, a dream job that had slowly turned into her lifeline. Lately, she'd been throwing herself into work with a fervor that left little room for me. I didn't mind, not at first, but now, standing alone in the house we'd built together, I wasn't so sure. I wandered into the kitchen, my stomach growling. The fridge was half empty, a detail I'd noticed more often lately. Audrey hadn't done a big grocery run in weeks, too busy with her clients to keep up with the small things. I grabbed a can of soda and leaned against the counter, my mind drifting. We weren't always like this. Once, Audrey and I had been inseparable. We met in college, both of us working the same thankless job at the campus bookstore. She was vibrant, opinionated, the kind of woman who could argue circles around me and still make me laugh about it. I fell hard and fast, and I thought she did too. But 10 years is a long time, and people change. Lately, it felt like we were speaking different languages. She'd come home late, her excuses thin and riddled with holes. Late nights with clients, she'd say, or catching up on deadlines. I wanted to believe her. I did. But the signs were there, small and insidious, creeping into the corners of our life like mold. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the way she'd started wearing makeup to run errands, the way her phone was always glued to her hand or face down on the counter. And then there was the red lipstick. Audrey hated red lipstick. Always said it made her feel like a clown. But a week ago, I'd found one in her purse, barely used, the brand unfamiliar. When I'd asked her about it, she shrugged, said it was a gift from a coworker. Something about the way she avoided my gaze stuck with me. The lie too casual, too rehearsed. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Audrey was stressed, overworked. That's all it was. But the crooked frame said otherwise. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside, the crisp fall air biting at my skin. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in the house, surrounded by the weight of unanswered questions. As I backed out of the driveway, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Audrey, her text brief and vague. Running late. Don't wait up. My grip tightened on the wheel. Running late again. Always late. Always busy. Always somewhere else. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets of Richmond blurring past. My mind was a storm, swirling with doubt and frustration. Was I paranoid? Or was there something real beneath the surface? Something she wasn't telling me? I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking. For the first time, I let myself consider the possibility, the one thought I'd been avoiding for weeks. What if she was lying to me? What if there was someone else? The idea made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers, not just for my sake, but for the marriage I thought we were fighting to save. As I sat there in the dim glow of the station lights, I made a decision. If Audrey was hiding something, I was going to find out. No more excuses, no more blind trust. She thought I didn't see it, that I was too naive to notice the cracks forming in our life. But Audrey didn't realize something about me. I don't just let things fall apart. I fix them, or I tear them down completely. The next morning, I woke up before Audrey, the resolve from the night before still coursing through me. She was still asleep, her dark hair splayed across the pillow, her breathing steady. I stared at her for a moment, wondering if the person I loved still existed beneath the surface of all the secrets. By the time she stirred, I was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee and pretending to scroll through my phone. She walked in, her maroon blouse from the day before crumpled in her hand. I glanced at her, waiting for an explanation, but she only smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and said she had another busy day ahead. Another busy day. Another excuse. I watched her leave, her bag slung over her shoulder, her phone already in her hand. As the door clicked shut, I set my coffee down and took a deep breath. It was time to get to work. The first thing I did was check her laptop. It sat on the desk in the living room, closed but not locked. Audrey had always been careless with passwords, and I knew hers by heart. It was her birthday. Simple, predictable, just like I'd always thought our marriage had been. Her emails were neatly organized, her inbox filled with messages from clients and colleagues. But one name stood out: Nathan. He wasn't a name I recognized, not one of her usual contacts. The subject lines were vague, but the timestamps told a story. Late nights, early mornings, a flurry of back and forth that didn't match the tone of her other work emails. I clicked on one at random. Nathan, last night was perfect. Same time next week? Audrey, of course. Can't wait. My chest tightened as I read the words, the casual intimacy in their exchange hitting me like a punch to the gut. There was no ambiguity here. This wasn't about work. I scrolled through more messages, my anger mounting with each one. The details were subtle, carefully worded, but the context was clear. Nathan wasn't a client. He was something more, something she'd been hiding from me for months. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The evidence was there, undeniable and irrefutable. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more than a few emails if I was going to tear down the web of lies she'd spun. I needed to see it for myself. That afternoon, I installed a tracker on her phone. It wasn't difficult. Audrey's phone was synced to our shared account, and the app one used was discreet and untraceable. It would log her location, her texts, even her calls. Every move she made would be cataloged, preserved as evidence. As I set up the app, a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the explosive way I'd been that morning. I was focused, methodical. If Audrey wanted to play games, I'd meet her on her own terms. That evening, she came home late again. She walked in with a smile, her hair freshly styled, the faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize lingering in the air. I asked her about her day, keeping my tone light, almost casual. She talked about a difficult client, her voice steady, her story rehearsed. I nodded along, pretending to believe her, even as my phone buzzed in my pocket with notifications from the tracker. It told a different story, a location ping from a restaurant across town, followed by an hour at a hotel. I smiled at her, my chest tightening as I kept up the facade. I asked if she wanted to watch a movie, but she declined, claiming she was tired. I watched as she disappeared down the hall, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything I'd discovered. The emails, the tracker logs, the way she looked at me with those practiced smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Audrey thought she was in control, that I was too blind to see the truth. But I wasn't blind. Not anymore. I was going to gather every piece of evidence, every lie, every betrayal, and lay it all out in front of her when the time was right. She wouldn't see it coming, and she wouldn't have anywhere to hide. Audrey had built her lies carefully, but she didn't realize one thing. I was a builder too, and I knew how to tear something apart with precision. The quiet investigation had begun, and there was no turning back. The next day, I followed my routine as though nothing had changed. Audrey kissed me goodbye, her perfume sharp and foreign, her smile as polished as ever. She didn't know I was watching, that I'd been watching for weeks, piecing together the fragments of her lies. As soon as she was out the door, I checked the tracker. Her location pinged at a coffee shop downtown, one I hadn't been to with her in years. I drove there, parking a block away, and waited. Her car was easy to spot, the same white sedan she'd had since we got married. It sat near the entrance, her bag visible in the passenger seat. I stayed long enough to confirm her next move. After an hour, she left the coffee shop, her location updating to an address I recognized from the tracker logs. A hotel, the same one she'd visited before. I followed at a safe distance, my chest tight as the reality of her betrayal came into sharper focus. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked far enough away to avoid suspicion. I watched as Audrey stepped out of her car, smoothing her skirt and glancing around before walking inside. She wasn't meeting a client. She was meeting Nathan. My jaw tightened as I snapped a few photos with my phone, each one a dagger to the chest. I didn't follow her inside. Confrontation would be too easy, too predictable. Audrey would cry, spin her excuses, blame me for her actions. No, I wanted something bigger, something she wouldn't see coming. That evening, Audrey came home with the same rehearsed smile, her tone bright and cheerful. She talked about her meeting, recounting some fabricated conversation with a client who didn't exist. I nodded along, pretending to listen, my stomach churning with the weight of what I knew. I asked her if she wanted to go out for dinner, but she declined, saying she had emails to catch up on. I watched her retreat to the bedroom, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, and felt the anger simmering just below the surface. She thought she was in control, that I was oblivious to the cracks in our marriage. But she didn't realize I was already 2 steps ahead. The next day, I called a lawyer. Rebecca was recommended by a friend who had gone through a divorce a year earlier. She was sharp, no nonsense, the kind of person who didn't take excuses. I explained the situation, laying out the evidence I'd gathered, the emails, the tracker logs, the photos. Her response was calm and measured. With what you have, this case is open and shut. If you're ready to move forward, we can file the papers and make sure you're protected. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'm ready. Rebecca gave me a list of next steps, including gathering financial records and documenting as much as I could about Audrey's behavior. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. The process had begun. That evening, I set the first piece of my plan into motion. Audrey had a habit of leaving her laptop open when she stepped away, and that night was no exception. She went to shower, her computer humming softly on the desk. I sat down, opened her email, and forwarded every incriminating message between her and Nathan to my personal account. Then I logged out, careful to leave no trace. When she came back into the room, she glanced at me, her expression neutral. "Long day?" she asked, her tone casual. I nodded, my face a mask of calm. "Just another day." She didn't suspect a thing. Over the next few days, I tightened the net. The tracker logs, the messages, the photos, all of it was compiled into a detailed timeline. I even tracked down Nathan's social media, finding photos of him with his wife and kids, their lives as carefully curated as Audrey's lies. The discovery filled me with a cold sense of satisfaction. He wasn't just a man having an affair. He was someone with just as much to lose. I debated whether to confront him directly, but decided against it. My revenge wasn't going to be a screaming match in a parking lot. It was going to be deliberate, precise, and final. Audrey thought she could juggle her double life without consequence. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. I wasn't just gathering evidence. I was building something she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. By the time Friday rolled around, the weight of my plan had settled into a quiet inevitability. Audrey was too wrapped up in her lies to notice the way I watched her, how my smiles had become a little sharper, my questions a little more probing. She thought she was clever, but her web of deceit was beginning to fray at the edges. That evening, she claimed she had to meet with a new client about a remodel. Her excuse was almost laughably vague. I asked where the client was located, feigning casual interest. She hesitated for a split second before naming a generic coffee shop on the other side of town. I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Have a good meeting," I said, kissing her cheek as she walked out the door. Once she was gone, I opened the tracker app. Her location updated within minutes, confirming what I already knew. She wasn't going to a coffee shop. She was heading back to the same hotel. I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Instead, I made a detour. I drove to Nathan's house, parking a safe distance away. It was a modest suburban home, its neat landscaping and cheerful porch light belying the chaos brewing inside. His wife's car was in the driveway, along with a tricycle tipped over on the lawn. The sight filled me with a cold determination. I had no intention of knocking on the door. Not yet. Instead, I left an envelope on the porch, tucked under a flower pot. Inside were printed copies of the photos and emails I'd gathered, along with a brief, anonymous note. You deserve to know the truth. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but I didn't care. My goal was simple: destroy the safety net Audrey and Nathan had built for themselves. If their relationship had flourished in secrecy, I would drag it into the light. By the time I got home, Audrey was already there, sitting on the couch with her laptop open. She looked up as I walked in, her smile tight, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Panic? It didn't matter. How was your meeting? I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded, her response automatic. Good. Productive. The client seems promising. I hummed in response, sinking into the armchair across from her. She returned her attention to her screen, her fingers tapping against the keys. I watched her for a moment, wondering how she could lie so easily, so convincingly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past few months in my mind. The pieces were all there, falling into place like a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. But now that the picture was clear, I couldn't look away. The next day, my phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. She's going to try and fight for the house. Be prepared for a counteroffer. I wasn't surprised. Audrey had always been territorial about the house, claiming it was her vision that had turned it into a home. But the irony wasn't lost on me. She turned our sanctuary into the setting for her betrayal. And now she wanted to keep it. I sent Rebecca a quick reply. Let her try. That afternoon, I received another notification from the tracker app. Audrey was at the hotel again. This time, she stayed longer than usual, her location static for nearly 3 hours. I imagined her with Nathan, their conversation filled with reassurances and half-baked plans for a future that would never come. The thought made my stomach churn, but I pushed it aside. She had no idea the foundation of her lies was crumbling beneath her. Later that evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I noticed the way she avoided my gaze. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it quickly before looking away, her movements stiff and unnatural. Tough day? I asked, my voice calm. She nodded, her response curt. Just busy. I didn't press her. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. She didn't realize it, but she was unraveling, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. That night, as she slept, I checked the tracker one last time. Her texts with Nathan were coming through in real time, each one more desperate than the last. Nathan, my wife knows. She found the photos. Audrey, oh my God, what did you tell her? Nathan, nothing yet. I need time to figure this out. Audrey, we'll get through this. We have to. I stared at the screen, my anger replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. They thought they could navigate the fallout, that they could weather the storm I'd unleashed. But they didn't know what was coming. Audrey had betrayed me, lied to me, humiliated me. And now, she was about to learn the cost of her choices. The web was unraveling, and when it finally collapsed, I would be there to ensure she felt every strand break. The morning after reading Audrey's frantic texts, I woke up with a sense of purpose. The net I'd cast around her lies was tightening, and there was no escape. She didn't know it yet, but the stage was set for the first act of her downfall. I wasn't just waiting for the collapse. I was orchestrating it. Audrey was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I entered, her expression guarded but carefully neutral. Morning, she said, her tone light. She was trying too hard to seem casual. Morning, I replied, grabbing a mug and pouring myself a cup. I leaned against the counter, watching her over the rim of my glass. Her eyes flicked back to her phone, her fingers tapping out a message. Busy day? I asked, keeping my voice even. She nodded without looking up. Back-to-back meetings. Probably won't be home until late. I hummed in response, setting my coffee down. Another late night, another lie. Once she left, I pulled up the tracker. Sure enough, her location pinged near the hotel within an hour. I didn't follow her this time. I didn't need to. The pieces were already falling into place, and I wasn't going to risk tipping my hand too soon. Instead, I called Rebecca. It's time, I said, my voice steady. File the papers. She didn't hesitate. You sure you're ready for this? I've never been more ready. That evening, Audrey came home later than usual. She walked in with a distracted air, her phone glued to her hand as she mumbled a quick hello. I watched her carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped her phone a little too tightly. Long day? I asked, feigning concern. She nodded, her response automatic. Exhausting. I'm going to shower. I waited until she disappeared into the bathroom before checking the tracker again. Her texts with Nathan were spiraling into chaos. Nathan, my wife served me with papers. She's taking the kids. Audrey, I'm so sorry. What do we do? Nathan, I don't know. I need to focus on fixing this. Audrey, you're not leaving me, are you? Nathan, I can't think about this right now. I smiled grimly at his response. The cracks in their affair were widening, their fantasy unraveling under the weight of reality. Nathan was losing his family, his stability, and soon Audrey would lose hers too. The next day, the divorce papers were delivered. Audrey was at home when the courier arrived, the envelope heavy with legal precision. I watched from the doorway as she opened it, her face going pale as she scanned the documents. Her hand trembled, the paper rustling as she tried to process what she was reading. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. What is this? You know exactly what it is, I said, my voice calm but firm. It's the consequences of your choices. Her mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. For the first time in months, she seemed at a loss, her composure shattered. She glanced back at the papers, her expression shifting from shock to anger. You've been spying on me? I crossed my arms, meeting her glare head-on. I've been uncovering the truth, Audrey. The emails, the texts, the hotel visits. I know everything. Her face crumpled, but instead of guilt, it was defiance that filled her voice. This isn't fair. You're not perfect, Caleb. You've been distant, always working, never paying attention to me. What was I supposed to do? I felt a flicker of anger at her audacity, but I didn't let it show. You were supposed to talk to me. You were supposed to honor the vows we made. Instead, you chose to lie, to betray me. That's on you, Audrey, not me. She stood there, her hands gripping the papers so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might finally take responsibility for what she'd done. But then her expression hardened. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice low and venomous. I'll make sure of it. I stepped closer, my voice cold. The only thing I regret is trusting you. That night, she packed a bag and left. I didn't stop her, didn't try to argue or convince her to stay. The papers were filed, the evidence irrefutable. There was no saving what she'd destroyed. When she drove away, I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear into the night. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, but for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like freedom. Over the next few days, I finalized the details with Rebecca. The house, the majority of our assets, and full custody of the kids would stay with me. Audrey's world was crumbling, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she realized just how much she'd lost. Nathan had stopped responding to her texts, his focus on salvaging what was left of his own life. The foundation of their affair, built on lies and stolen moments, had collapsed under its own weight. Audrey thought she could manipulate her way out of this, that she could still control the narrative. But she didn't realize the story was no longer hers to tell. The breaking point had come and gone. Now, all that was left was to watch her face the fallout. Audrey didn't come home for days after she left with her bag that night. I wasn't surprised. I imagined she was at a hotel, or maybe with Nathan, though the cracks in their relationship made it seem unlikely. Wherever she was, it didn't matter. The papers had been filed, the groundwork laid. Her absence was only prolonging the inevitable. The boys asked about her once or twice, their questions hesitant. Is Mom okay? Maddox asked one evening as we sat on the couch, watching a rerun of his favorite show. She's fine, I said, keeping my tone even. She just needs some time to figure things out. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Noah, too young to grasp the full gravity of the situation, stayed quiet. I reassured them as best I could, promising that no matter what happened, we would get through it together. The next move in the game came from Audrey. A week after the papers were delivered, her lawyer filed a counterclaim. She wanted shared custody of the boys, half the assets, and, laughably, the house. It was a blatant attempt to negotiate from a position of weakness, and Rebecca saw right through it. "She has no leg to stand on," Rebecca said during one of our calls. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the prenup ensures she won't get more than what's outlined. She's stalling, hoping to wear you down." I wasn't surprised. Audrey had always been a fighter, but this wasn't a battle she could win. That same week, I received an unexpected email from Nathan's wife. It was short and to the point, her words laced with quiet fury. "Thank you for the information. It confirmed what I suspected for months. He's out of the house, and I'm filing for divorce. I hope you find peace after all of this." I stared at the email for a long time, the weight of it settling over me. I didn't respond. What could I say? But her words lingered in my mind. She had lost her husband, her family torn apart by the same lies that had nearly destroyed mine. It was a reminder of how far-reaching the damage could be, how betrayal didn't just ripple, it shattered. Audrey finally called me 2 weeks later. Her name lit up on my phone screen, and for a moment, I debated whether to answer. When I did, her voice was sharp and brittle, like a glass ready to crack. "We need to talk," she said. "About the boys. About the divorce." I kept my tone steady. "Then talk." She hesitated, caught off guard by my calmness. "I want to see the boys." "This isn't fair, Caleb. You can't keep them from me." "I'm not keeping them from you," I replied. "But you walked out, Audrey. You made your choices. The court will decide what happens next." Her frustration bubbled over, her voice rising. "You're trying to punish me. You think this is all my fault, but you're not perfect, Caleb. You were never home, always working. What was I supposed to do? Sit around and wait for you to notice me?" The audacity of her words stung, but I didn't let it show. I kept my voice calm, controlled. "You could have talked to me, Audrey. You could have told me how you felt. Instead, you lied, cheated, and tore our family apart. That's on you, not me." She went silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." Neither did I. The next day, Rebecca called to confirm that Audrey's counterclaim had been rejected. The court sided with me, granting full custody of the boys and solidifying my claim to the house and our assets. Audrey was left with little more than what the prenup allowed, a modest settlement and her personal belongings. Her lawyer tried to push back, but it was futile. The evidence was too strong, the terms too airtight. The game was over, and Audrey had lost. When she came to pick up her things later that week, she was quiet, subdued. She moved through the house like a stranger, boxing up clothes and personal items without meeting my eyes. The boys stayed upstairs, their presence a reminder of what she'd forfeited. As she carried the last box to her car, she paused in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I never wanted it to end like this, Caleb." I nodded, my voice steady. "Neither did I." She opened her mouth to say more, but then closed it, shaking her head. Without another word, she got into her car and drove away, the taillights disappearing down the street. That night, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of finality. The fallout had been messy, painful, but it was over now. Audrey had made her choices, and I had made mine. The boys and I would be okay. We would heal, rebuild, and move forward. Audrey thought she could escape the consequences of her actions, that she could rewrite the story to suit her narrative. But in the end, the truth had caught up with her. And as I sat there, staring at the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. In the weeks after Audrey left for good, the house began to feel like mine again. Not ours, not hers, but mine and the boys. It was a strange sensation, reclaiming a space that had once been filled with her presence. The empty spots where her things used to be felt like blank pages, ready for a new story to be written. The boys adjusted faster than I expected. Maddox threw himself into soccer, his energy focused and determined. He didn't talk much about his mom, but when he did, it was with a guarded edge that told me he wasn't ready to forgive her. Noah, on the other hand, asked more questions, about why things happened the way they did, about whether Audrey still loved them. "She does love you," I told him one night as I tucked him in. "But sometimes adults make choices that hurt people, even when they don't mean to." He nodded, his little face thoughtful, and then he hugged me tightly. "You'll always be here though, right, Dad?" "Always," I said, my voice steady. "No matter what." Rebecca finalized the divorce paperwork a month later. The terms were exactly as we'd hoped. Full custody of the boys, the house, and the assets I'd worked for. Audrey had signed without further resistance. The fight drained out of her after the court ruling. She'd moved into a small apartment across town, her life now a pale shadow of the one she'd tried to hold on to. I started making changes to the house, not drastic ones, but enough to make it feel like a fresh start. I painted the walls a warm, welcoming color, replaced the furniture Audrey had picked out with pieces that felt more like us. The boys helped, their excitement infectious as we turned the house into a place that felt truly ours. We even built a small garden in the backyard, a project that became a bonding experience for all of us. Maddox planted tomatoes, while Noah insisted on sunflowers because they were happy plants. Watching them work side by side, their laughter filling the air, I felt a flicker of hope for the future. One afternoon, as I was clearing out some old boxes in the attic, I came across our wedding album. It was tucked away in the corner, its cover gathering dust. I sat down and flipped through it, the photos a stark reminder of what once was. There we were, grinning on the beach, the ocean stretching out behind us. Audrey's eyes sparkled with joy, her hand clasped tightly in mine. I stared at the picture for a long time, wondering if that version of us had ever really existed, or if it was just another illusion. I closed the album and set it aside. It didn't hurt to look at it anymore, but it didn't bring me joy either. It was just a relic, a snapshot of a life that no longer belonged to me. Audrey made sporadic attempts to reach out to the boys. She called once a week, her voice hesitant as she asked about their lives. Maddox kept the conversations brief, while Noah chatted more freely, his innocence shielding him from the weight of her choices. I didn't interfere. Their relationship with her was theirs to navigate, and I wouldn't stand in the way. But I made it clear that she wouldn't be welcomed back into our lives on her terms. The boundaries were firm, the trust irreparably broken. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Maddox looked up from his plate, his expression thoughtful. "You seem happier," Daddy said. I blinked, caught off guard. "Doi." He nodded. "Yeah, like, lighter, I guess." I glanced at Noah, who was nodding in agreement, his mouth full of spaghetti. Their words sank in, and I realized they were right. The weight I'd carried for so long, the doubt, the anger, the betrayal, was gone. In its place was something simpler, something steadier. I smiled, my chest tightening with a mix of pride and gratitude. "That's because I have you too," I said. "You're what matters most." Maddox smirked, and Noah grinned, and for a moment, the world felt perfect. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the pain of Audrey's betrayal faded into the background. It wasn't gone, but it no longer defined us. We had moved forward, rebuilt something stronger, something that felt unbreakable. And as I stood in the garden one evening, watching the boys chase fireflies under a sky streaked with orange and pink, I knew we were going to be okay. We weren't just surviving. We were thriving. With each passing day, the shadows of the past grew fainter. The house, once a battleground of unspoken tension and hidden betrayals, had become a sanctuary, a place of laughter, warmth, and new beginnings. The boys and I had found our rhythm, a steady cadence of life that felt genuine and unshakable. Maddox's soccer team made it to the regional championships that fall, and his passion for the sport seemed to grow with every match. Watching him on the field, his focus sharp and his movements confident, filled me with pride. He was channeling his energy into something positive, something that gave him a sense of purpose and joy. Noah, meanwhile, had taken to sketching. He spent hours in his room with a sketch pad, drawing everything from animals to intricate blueprints for tree houses he wanted to build. One evening, he showed me a design he'd been working on, a sprawling treehouse with a slide, a rope ladder, and even a small balcony. "We could build it together," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "It could be our project." I grinned, ruffling his hair. Let's do it. The project became a family endeavor. Weekends were spent gathering supplies, hammering boards into place, and painting the structure in bright, cheerful colors. Maddox helped with the heavy lifting, while Noah took charge of the creative details, adding small touches that made the treehouse uniquely ours. When it was finished, the boys invited their friends over for a grand opening. Watching them climb the rope ladder and shout from the balcony, their laughter ringing out across the yard, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The treehouse wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of how far we'd come. Audrey remained a distant figure in our lives. She called sporadically, her attempts to reconnect with the boys polite but strained. Maddox rarely spoke to her, his resentment still simmering just below the surface, while Noah maintained a guarded but civil relationship. I didn't push either of them. They were navigating their own feelings, and I respected their boundaries. One afternoon, Leah, Audrey's sister, reached out. Her voice was tentative, almost apologetic. I just wanted to check in, Caleb. How are you and the boys doing? We're good, I replied. Better than good, actually. She hesitated, then sighed. Audrey's been struggling. She regrets what happened, you know. I leaned back in my chair, my grip tightening on the phone. Leah, I appreciate the concern, but that's not something I can fix for her. I know, she said softly. I just thought you should know. Despite Leah's words, I felt no obligation to engage with Audrey's regret. Her struggles were hers to face, just as mine had been. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds either. My focus was on the life I was building with the boys, not the one I'd left behind. One evening, as we sat around the fire pit in the backyard, Maddox turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Do you think you'll ever date again, Dad? He asked, his tone curious rather than teasing. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I thought about everything we'd been through, the pain and the healing, and the life we'd rebuilt from the ground up. Maybe someday, I said honestly. But right now, I'm happy with how things are. Noah grinned, poking at the fire with a stick. If you do, she better like tree houses. We laughed, the sound warm and easy, and I realized how far we'd come. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy us had become a distant memory, a chapter we'd closed together. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The life we'd built wasn't perfect, but it was ours, filled with love, resilience, and the strength to keep moving forward. The past no longer defined us. We were writing a new story, one filled with hope and promise. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we were ready for it. Together. By winter, the treehouse in the backyard had become more than just a playground. It was a meeting place, a hideout, a fortress of imagination for the boys and their friends. Every time I looked at it, I felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't just a treehouse. It was a testament to what we'd built together, a symbol of strength and renewal. Life moved forward with a quiet steadiness. Maddox was excelling in school, his confidence growing both on and off the soccer field. He'd been named team captain, a role he embraced with maturity that often made me forget he was still just a teenager. Noah, meanwhile, had started taking art classes at the local community center. His sketches were becoming more detailed, more ambitious, and his teachers often commented on his talent. Watching them thrive filled me with a deep sense of satisfaction. They were resilient, stronger than I'd ever imagined, and I like to think I'd played a part in that. One afternoon, as I worked in the garage, Maddox came in, holding his phone. "Dad, there's someone here for you," he said, his tone curious. I wiped my hands on a rag, frowning. "Who?" He shrugged, stepping aside to reveal a woman standing at the edge of the driveway. She was tall, with kind eyes and a warm smile, bundled up against the cold in a thick scarf and coat. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Nathan's wife. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. She extended a gloved hand, her expression calm but guarded. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "My name's Lauren. We haven't met, but I think we both know why I'm here." I shook her hand, the weight of the moment settling over me. I'd never expected to meet her, let alone have a conversation. Her voice was steady, but there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored something I'd seen in my own reflection months ago. "How can I help you?" I asked, my tone careful. She hesitated, glancing down at her hands before meeting my gaze. "I just wanted to say thank you for telling me the truth. It wasn't easy to hear, but it saved me from living a lie." Her words caught me off guard, and I nodded, unsure of what to say. She continued, her voice soft. "I've moved on mostly. Filed for divorce, sold the house. But I've always wondered how you're doing. How your boys are doing." "We're good," I said, my voice steady. "Better than I expected, honestly." She smiled faintly, her breath fogging in the cold air. "I'm glad to hear that." There was a pause, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between us. Finally, she sighed and reached in her pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "If you ever need to talk," she said, handing it to me. "About any of it." I took the paper, my fingers brushing against the edge. It had her number written on it, along with her email. I looked up at her, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," I said finally. She nodded, her expression softening. "Take care, Caleb." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the driveway, the folded paper clutched in my hand. That evening, as I sat on the couch, I thought about Lauren's visit. Her words lingered in my mind, a reminder of how far we'd both come. We were strangers bound by the same betrayal, but we'd taken different paths to rebuild our lives. I didn't call her, not yet, but the idea of connecting with someone who understood, who had lived through the same storm, gave me a strange sense of comfort. The boys noticed a change in me after that day. I laughed more, smiled more. Maddox teased me about it once, smirking as he asked if I'd met someone. I didn't answer, just ruffled his hair and told him to finish his homework. Maybe I had met someone, or maybe I was just realizing that the future was still wide open, filled with possibilities I hadn't considered before. The house no longer felt like a place where the past lingered. It felt alive, filled with the sound of the boys' laughter, the scent of fresh paint from Noah's Ark projects, and the warmth of a life we'd created together. Audrey's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything. But now, as I sat by the fire with the boys, their faces lit with joy as they told me about their day, I realized it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something better. Spring brought a sense of renewal, the kind that made everything feel possible again. The treehouse became a hub of activity for the boys and their friends, a place filled with laughter and the kind of freedom only childhood can bring. The garden we'd planted was flourishing, the sunflowers tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze. Life was good, simple, steady, and real. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Lauren. Caleb, I hope this isn't intrusive, but I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee sometime. No pressure, just two people who understand what it's like to start over. I stared at the message for a long moment, the sunlight glinting off the screen. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight of understanding, of shared experience. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, before finally typing a reply. "Coffee sounds good. Let me know when works for you." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh-baked bread wafting through the air. Lauren was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a mug in her hands. She looked up as I approached, her smile warm but tentative. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure if you'd say yes." I shrugged, returning her smile. Sometimes it's nice to talk to someone who gets it. The conversation flowed easily, our shared experiences creating an immediate connection. We talked about everything, our kids, our careers, the ways we'd rebuild our lives after the betrayals that had nearly broken us. There was no bitterness, no dwelling on the past, just two people finding common ground in the present. By the time we parted ways, the weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying felt a little lighter. Lauren and I started meeting occasionally, first for coffee, then for walks in the park or afternoons at the art museum. It wasn't romantic, at least not at first. It was more like finding a friend in a sea of strangers, someone who understood the nuances of healing, of moving forward without losing yourself in the process. The boys met her eventually, during a casual afternoon at the park. She brought her son, a shy 10-year-old named Lucas who bonded with Noah over their shared love of building things. Watching them laugh together, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. Months passed, and what started as friendship began to grow into something more. Lauren and I took things slowly, careful not to rush or force anything. It was uncharted territory for both of us, but it felt natural, like finding a missing piece of the puzzle. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the boys play in the yard, Lauren turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what you've gained instead of what you've lost?" Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded after a moment. "All the time," I said. "It took me a while, but I've realized that what I have now, it's more than I ever thought I could." She smiled, her hand brushing lightly against mine. "Me too." By the end of the year, Lauren and I had blended our lives in ways that felt seamless and genuine. Our kids became fast friends, their laughter filling the spaces that had once felt so empty. The house, the treehouse, the garden. They all became part of a life I hadn't dared to dream of when everything fell apart. Audrey was still a distant presence, her role in our lives reduced to occasional phone calls and a rare holiday visit. She tried to mend things with the boys, but the trust she'd broken was hard to rebuild. I no longer felt anger toward her, only a sense of finality. Her chapter in my life was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Maddox raised his glass of sparkling cider, a mischievous grin on his face. To Dad, he said, "For being the best builder, fixer, and pancake maker ever." Noah laughed, raising his glass too. "And for being the best dad ever." Lauren smiled, her eyes meeting mine as she raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said softly. We clinked our glasses together, the sound ringing out like a promise, a declaration of everything we'd built together. As I looked around the table, at the people I loved most in the world, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The past was behind us, its scars faded, but not forgotten. And the future? It was bright, full of promise and possibility. Audrey's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything, but it had led me here, to a life I wouldn't trade for anything. We weren't just survivors. We were creators, builders, dreamers. And we were exactly where we were meant to be, together. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and what you do in my situation.